Okay, good morning, authors and mystery lovers on this first day of spring. My name is Janet Vine, and I will be the moderator of this historical mysteries panel, Shakers, Quakers, Revolutionaries, and Depression Era Cop. At the end of the panel discussion, we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions, and you can direct your questions to the panel as a whole or to a particular author on the panel. You may type your questions at any time or wait until the Q&A. Now, let me introduce the members of the panel. First, Edith Maxwell. Edith Maxwell is a prolific writer of mysteries, an Agatha-winning and McCavity nominated author. She writes the Quaker midwife mysteries and the local food mysteries, as well as an award-winning short crime fiction. As Maddie Day, she authors the Country Store mysteries and the Cozy Capers book group mysteries. She also wrote 2 Lorraine Rousseau mysteries. Maxwell lives north of Boston with her beau, an Energizer kitten, and blogs with the other wicked authors and mystery lovers kitchen.
Thank you.
Is Eleanor Kuhns, who earned a master's degree in library science and was the assistant director of the Goshen Public Library in Orange County, New York. Her first book, A Simple Murder, was a 2011 winner of the Minotaur Books Mystery Writers of America first crime novel competition. Since then, she has written 9 more Shaker mysteries featuring Will Reese. Third is Carol Pouliot. Carol is a former French and Spanish teacher, world traveler, and owner of a business. She is currently the author of the Blackwell and Watson time travel mysteries, traditional police procedurals with a seemingly impossible relationship between Depression-era cop Stephen Blackwell and 21st century journalist Olivia Watson. She lives in the quiet countryside of upstate New York, where the snow in winter reaches over 13 feet. Our final panelist is Mally Becker of New Jersey, who began her professional career in New York City as a publicist and freelance magazine writer. She then got her law degree and worked for 20 years as an energy lawyer and later as an advocate for children in foster care. Her first American Revolutionary War mystery book, The Turncoat's Widow, was just published in February. Congratulations, Mally. And now let's get to our questions. Panelists, my first question for you is what with Edith, because you've written so many different types of books. Why historical mysteries?
I have. So I was writing cozy mysteries, and but I've always been interested in historical homes, and I've only lived in antique homes for the last 40 years since I moved to New England. And I read about, we moved to Amesbury 13 years ago, and I read about the Great Fire of 1888. Amesbury was world famous for their carriage manufacturers, and it burned down most of the carriage factories. I read a newspaper article about it, and I thought, oh, and my house was built for the mill workers for the buildings down the street, which are now stores and restaurants. And I thought, what if a mill girl living in my house solved the mystery of the arson of the Great Fire? So I wrote a short story, and the characters and setting and era didn't want to go away. As happens with us, they knock at your brain. And so I invented this mill girl's Aunt Rose, who's a 24-year-old midwife when the series starts, mid-20s. And that was the catalyst, reading that news article. And I've been a member of the Amesbury Friends meeting for over 30 years, and now I can walk to church on Sundays. And so I loved weaving in the Quakers into the series. More about that later, but that was the catalyst, reading that newspaper article.
Okay, Eleanor.
One of my hobbies is hand weaving. I have a couple of looms, So I wanted to use that. They tell you to write about what you know. And so I needed a time period where weaving was still used by a lot of people. And I also did not want to rely on the modern DNA and the forensics, although fascinating. I wanted to go back to a time when you had to use your brain, deduction and all of that. So, and then of course, I was visiting my mother in Maine. I went up and down 95 because she was ill pretty much every weekend. And there is the only still existent Shaker community there. Mm-hmm. And I went on a tour, and that was the beginning. I knew I had something, so I put them all together.
Okay, Carol. You're mute. Unmute. We can't hear you.
Jim, can you help us?
Try again, Carol.
Thank you. I had a cough and I didn't want to interrupt Eleanor, so I muted myself and then I couldn't get it back. So, okay, my story is, I think, quite unusual, and I actually never told anybody what happened to me for decades. But then when I started writing and people asked me why this time period and how I got the idea, I started telling the story again. When I was 29 years old and in my first apartment, living alone, I was teaching at the time, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was terrified before I opened my eyes. I felt like somebody was in the apartment. If you live alone or you've ever lived alone, you know how it feels when somebody else is there. And I opened my eyes and there was a man standing at my bedroom door. Honestly, I don't know why I didn't have a heart attack on the spot. My heart was pounding, and then it was like I stopped breathing and my brain was screaming, oh my God, how am I going to get out of here? And I had a light on in the living room so I could see a little bit shadows and stuff in his face. He leaned in, sort of peered in at me. Meanwhile, I'm, dying. And then he stood up, he shook his head, and he walked through the wall. I turned on the light and I shook uncontrollably for probably a half hour before I was able to go back to sleep. It happened 4 nights in a row. Now, after the first night, obviously, I didn't feel I wasn't afraid of being physically harmed, but I had no idea what. I mean, I don't do drugs. I wasn't drunk. I didn't know. I was awake. I wasn't dreaming. So on the 4th night, I said, hello, are you real? And he looked and he never came back again. So obviously I never forgot that. I remember him as if it was last night. He was about 5'10", average build, dark brown hair, slicked back like the 30s, which is why I chose the 30s. He had a brown and green plaid flannel shirt like work clothes and dark pants. And some years later, I heard about Einstein's theory that all time happens at the same time. Einstein believed there was no past, present, or future. And he thought that if conditions were right, time could fold over and you could see something from another time. So I took that experience and I turned the man into my Depression era cop, Stephen, and I turned me into Olivia, the 21st century, sidekick, as it were. So stranger than truth is stranger than fiction. So that's where I got going.
Thank you. And Mally, now to you.
Do I really have to follow that story? Um,
You've got a good one, I know.
Well, I didn't mean to write a book. I volunteered at the Morristown National Historical Park, where Washington and his men spent 2 awful winters, and I thought I'd be clearing trails. It was really a thank you for all the great family vacations we've had at different national parks. But they took one look at me, and instead of clearing trails, they put me in the archives. And while there, I found an indictment for the Revolutionary War crime of traveling from New Jersey to New York City. The expression was without permission or passport. I grew up in New York City and around New York City, and for whatever reason, this just really offended me. I didn't understand it, and I took the document to the park historian, who said, let me disabuse you of your notions of the revolution. Maybe less than 50% of the population south of New England supported independence. And here in New Jersey, there was so much spying and smuggling into British-held New York City that government made it a crime to travel. And that's when I started playing the writer's game of what if, because I had a divided nation, not that we would know what that's like. I had spying and I had smuggling, and that was the spark for me. I
Great.
wish I had a ghost.
Maybe you will. Research is very important in establishing a time period, making your setting believable. Explain the kind of research you did and what resources you used. And I'm going to start again with you, Edith.
Okay. Well, I have a long, dusty doctorate in linguistics, so I love research. And language is among them. So my series started in 1888, which I neglected to mention in the Great Fire of 1888. And so I love looking up words. Did people use that word then? What did it mean? If it only came into the language in written form, like in 1887, can I use it in my dialogue and my characters, thoughts and stuff. Quaker life, that's pretty rich. John Greenleaf Whittier is a character in my books. I'm a docent at the Whittier Home Museum, which is half a mile down the road and another block to the Quaker Meeting House, which was built in 1851, and Whittier was on the building committee. So there's a lot of rich resources in this area about Quakers. Everyday life. There's a place called the Norlands Washburn Living History Center in Livermore, Maine, and you can go and live the life of an 1878 farm family for 24 hours. So I put on my long linen skirt and my boots and my apron, and I went and did the 24 hours right down to the chamber pot under the bed, and going to the one-room schoolhouse, which put me right back in the Laura books. It was really, really illustrative about how to do that kind of research, how to write about everyday life and how people cooked and what they ate and everything. Let's see, and carriages, which Amesbury was famous for, and I've got the Amesbury Carriage Museum has been a huge resource, and I've gone riding in a carriage, that one of the board members owns with her horse. And then each book has a theme. So Turning the Tide, the second book was women's suffrage. Third book, and Charity's Burden, which won the Agatha Award for Best Historical Novel last year, has a theme of abortion and contraception in the 19th century. And I delved quite deeply into that and learned how women could and could not seek ways to avoid pregnancy or end a pregnancy, whether safely or dangerous. So yeah, the research is great. And our local library has a fabulous, reference librarian who has helped me hugely. So there's so many.
You'll get your teacup maybe this year.
Yeah, get my teapot. I hope. Well, they may have to mail it to me this year. They will.
Yes. Okay.
Thank
Next, Carol.
Yeah, like Edith, I have a degrees in languages, and I use as many primary sources as I can. When I go to Albany for our Sisters in Crime chapter meetings, I go to the New York State Library, which has a fantastic collection of magazines, the actual magazine, not on film, magazines that were published in 1934, and they have newspapers from that time on film. So I can read the newspapers that Stephen and his fellow cops are reading during the week that they're hunting down a killer. I got lucky when I was writing Threshold of Deceit because I had already picked a week in April. And when I looked up the newspaper headlines, the feds were searching for John Dillinger. So that was a perfect headline for my cops to be discussing. And because Olivia spends time in 1934 now with Stephen, they learned how to travel back and forth to each other's time. And since she was a journalist, she's just eating up all those, sources. I've been reading the magazines, Good Housekeeping magazine and McCall's that come out during that time. I found that in 1934, canned peaches, was a very well thought of dessert for your supper table. So it's funny to see the differences. I use a 1929 Sears catalog for just about everything. It's wonderful. Household furnishings, clothes, Christmas presents. I have an actual 1934 February radio guide, so I can look up the actual radio shows that Stephen listens to and what time and what day of the week. Syracuse hosts the Nationals every summer, not during the pandemic, and that's a classic car show. So I can go to the state fairgrounds and see all the cars from the late 20s and early 30s. I can sit in them. Some of the guys have started them up because I wanted to hear what the muffler sounded like and what the horns sounded like. I have my grandmother's photo albums, so I use those extensively. I interviewed my father, and he was a child in the 30s, and he had very vivid memories of things. So those are some of the things. There's more, but I think I talked enough.
Okay, Eleanor.
Well, I have a number of things that I do. My first book, The Simple Murder, was with the Shakers. So when we stopped at the Shaker community, which is Sabbath Day Lake, it's right near Falmouth, Maine. They give tours because the only remaining Shakers are still living there. And I was very fortunate that the tour guide was the daughter of an orphan that had been taken in by the Shakers, and she had a number of stories. So, and I went afterwards to the shop. I bought a copy of every book that was there, and some of them were reprints of original sources: Mother Ann Lee's Advice to Children, Mother Ann Lee's Prayers, and so forth. So I was able to use all of that. I'm also a librarian, and New York State has newspapers, not just from New York, but from all over the country that are historical, and I use them heavily, but I use them online. I don't necessarily go to the New York State Library all the time, although I've been there. Since Reese is a traveler, I also try to go the places where he has been. In Death in Salem, I went to Salem 3 times so that I could get an idea of what was going on then. Although it was not, it's many years after the witch trials. Salem has had a very storied history, and during that time, all of the merchants were going out and opening up China. It was the wealthiest town in the country at that point, and their custom duties alone supported the federal government. So that was interesting. And they have various things like a reproduction of a sailing ship. And of course, in the current one, I sent Reese and Lydia down to the Great Dismal. So I try to do as many things as I can possibly do to make it realistic and accurate at the same time. And the newspapers, I just have to say, like Carol, are a wonderful, wonderful resource because you get an idea of how people think and what was happening at that time. For one thing, all the newspapers of the time, including in New York and in Maine, were full of ads for runaway slaves. Who knew? So it's really has been, newspapers have been really, really important for my research.
Nally.
All of the above. The New York Public Library has a fabulous digital collection that's free. And if you're working in any historical period and want to see magazines, they've got them, but also maps, which were tremendously helpful to me since New York City didn't really look like what it looks like now. In 1780, it was narrower. And besides, a third of the city had been burned down, but that's part of my story and another story. I think of it as history with a capital H and a small h. You know, books and articles are great for events, but the fun for me is the details that make a period come to life. So I also went to Williamsburg at some point and saw this fabulous wig from the period with a miniature British frigate as its decoration. So that had to find its way into the story. Or a quote from one of John Adams's journals from a visit to New York City, which he hated. And I put some of his words into my heroine's mouth. So that was a lot of fun. But for those of you interested in writing a historical mystery, going to small museums is tremendously helpful. Eleanor mentioned picking up books at one museum shop. They've got the quirkiest pamphlets. So I picked up books on children's games at the time and included some of those in the book. So that was a great help. I also went on a Revolutionary War tour of New York City. And then finally, talking to people who know more than I do, which is a lot of people. So the historian at the Morristown Historical Park was a huge help in that regard. So anybody you can talk to is going to make your story richer.
Very
Can
good.
I just add that I had meant to mention maps too. So important. And I have a map from 1880 and 1890, and they're aerial maps. And I read that they went up in hot air balloons to draw them. And one is from, like, we have a big river to the south. It's from the river looking into town. And one is from the hill that goes up behind my house looking the other direction. And they label the churches and the post office and people's homes and businesses. And I have them digitally so I could zoom in and see those labels. It's fabulous. Yeah.
I wanted to add too that the Shaker community in Alfred, Maine, the Sabbath Day Lake, they turned their schoolhouse into a little museum, and they will let you look at all the records and the archives if you make an appointment.
Yeah.
So that's helpful too.
Yeah, I'm going to add one thing too. When I was writing Threshold of Deceit, one of my characters, actually a couple characters, are teachers. So I went to the local high school and looked at old yearbooks to see what clubs and organizations they had for the class of 1934, to see how many kids were in a class in a small town. So that was a resource that I never would have imagined, but I got a wealth of detail out of it.
I know researching is so much fun and you get so many facts. Now, my next question is, how do you decide which details to use and which ones to discard, or leave for a future time so that the pacing of your narration doesn't get bogged down with facts? And Edith, I'm going to start with you again.
You know, the story has to come first. Primarily, I'm writing a murder mystery. And so that has to come first. And weaving in those little details, that makes it rich. But you can't, we all know that. You can't just do an info dump of, oh, this is how many different kinds of carriages existed in 1890. And, no, like she saw that one go down the street, or here comes that person she didn't want to talk to in a dray or in a cabriolet or a Stanhope drop front. But the story has to come first, like always. That's all there is to it.
Eleanor, I'm going to have you go next.
Yeah, I agree with Edith. The story has to come first. So as I'm writing along, I basically write a 300-page outline, in a sense, which has most of the plot and the story. And then I go back and I add a lot of the details. I mean, some of them are in before, like it's April and they're riding in a wagon and Lydia pushes back her cloak so she can feel the sun, that kind of thing. But I try to have pretty much my plot nailed down first, because the story is first, and you don't want to have a 10-page description of what they're wearing and all of that. But I do use author's notes quite a bit. I didn't have them in my first couple of books, and I got a lot of questions about some of the things. Now I try to answer the questions beforehand by having a pretty extensive author's note that involves historical details. What was, were they sick? Did they have an epidemic? What was happening politically? That kind of thing.
Mally?
Well, I was glad, Eleanor, that you had that historical note. I just finished it and you answered all my questions. So there's an expression we've all heard as writers, kill your darlings. If prose is just too beautiful and takes people out of the stories. Well, I have trouble killing my historical darlings, but you have to be ruthless. So I'm not as disciplined as you all probably are, since I've only got one book under my belt. But if a detail makes you think about that historical detail and not the story, it's got to go.
Carol?
Well, I feel like I have a little bit of a different situation because I have a cross-genre book where, yes, my books are police procedurals, they're mysteries, but I have the time travel twist. So part of my books are Olivia's experiences when she goes into 1934. I have had to, not write as much as what I would like to include, like everybody said. But what I do is I try to imagine the scene. I close my eyes and put myself in her place. What would she smell? How would Stephen's cookies taste? They drink tea and eat Fig Newtons at night. Well, they wouldn't have all the additives. So Olivia can make a comment sitting at the kitchen table like, oh, these taste better than at my time. She notices everybody is smoking everywhere, which they no longer do now. So it's a fine balance, but I feel like part of the enjoyment is walking in her shoes. What would it really be like? She has to wear garters and stockings. And how does that feel when you sit down? She's adjusting to the feel on her thighs of the garters, but she likes the silk lining in some of the skirts and the camisoles she's wearing. So I think that if you're very, very careful, a couple details here and there sprinkled in conversation, in a thought, Doesn't have to be an info dump, but it really enriches, in my case, using language also, you know, a distinct, you know, if you didn't notice at the beginning of chapter whatever, we're in 1934, when you hear somebody saying, oh, gee, that's swell. Oh, yeah, we're back there. So those details keep you sort of like in a hug, surrounded in your time frame without overloading like a heavy coat. So.
Okay, now, how does the time period in which you write affect how your detective, sleuth, or cop does his or her job? And Edith, start off.
Okay. So I have an amateur sleuth, Rose Carroll, the now Dodge, my Quaker midwife. She's the amateur sleuth, and her time period, like, she's not a professional, so she talks to people. She hears secrets in the bedchambers when they're in labor, when her women are in labor. We all know that women sometimes say things in labor that they might not otherwise. And she goes around town and asks questions. But that's kind of basic to any amateur sleuth, even in my contemporary cozy series. What I was really interested in was how the police worked in 1888 and after and around it. And I was looking and looking and looking for details about that. And I reached out to Frankie Bailey, who found me the Massachusetts Peace Officer, a manual for sheriffs, constables, police, and other civil officers that was published in 1880. And I got a copy on Amazon or eBay or somewhere. And oh, it's fabulous. It's got all the procedure, and it's got little like case histories for illustrating each one. And from that, so I've learned that, so fingerprinting was starting to come in Europe, but they didn't have it yet. What's the other? I wrote it down here. There's no blood typing, reliable blood typing. So they were starting to do transfusions in England, and half the people died because they didn't know what blood type to use. Of course, no DNA, or even, yeah, that bullet came from that kind of gun, but they didn't have rifling analysis. But I learned little things like a police officer, at least in Massachusetts, when he went to make the arrest, they had to touch the person's arm when they said, I arrest you for. So they had to touch their person, you know, maybe to make physical contact. And there may be nobody in the universe that knows that that's correct except me, talking about the previous question. But it's just a little detail I can slide in because I know that's what they did. And I know that they had to bring someone before the magistrate within 24 hours. And the magistrate could be anywhere. Anyway, little details like that. So I'm so indebted to Frankie for 7 books now of giving me Massachusetts police procedure. Thank you, Frankie. And, you know, but basically it was fingerprints, and not fingerprints, it was interviewing people, the police, maybe seeing a footprint in the mud, magnifying glasses, you know, Sherlock Holmes level stuff.
Okay, Eleanor.
Well, in my period, in a sense, everybody was an amateur. They were just starting to think that they had to have, in effect, peace officers. Prior to that, they had this very loose system of justices of the peace and sheriffs and constables. And you might have one sheriff in Maine and all the rest of the people were constables, and they only paid a stipend. So everybody had another job. So in the Will Reese, he works a lot with the constable in his town, Simon Rouge, and he runs a tavern. That's how he makes his living. Being a constable is almost like a side job or a side hustle, as we call it now. They were starting in England with the peelers, but a lot of the beginning shots at having a real police department, they earned their money by reward. And as you can imagine, they could arrest anybody and claim the reward. So it was ripe for abuse. So they were just starting in Boston and Philadelphia to have real police departments. And as the 19th century went on, most of the police departments were based on the Metropolitan Police in London, which did not start until 1829. So Reese helps Rouge quite a bit, but everybody is an amateur at that point. So quite interesting. And I get a lot of comments where people were saying, well, why doesn't he have a job as a detective? Well, in effect, there were none.
Very good. Valley?
Well, my protagonist, Becca Parcell, is an amateur spy. So first I had to make sure that there really were at least a handful of female spies during the American Revolution, and there were. So it might not have been probable, but she's plausible. I had to make her a widow, or at least I thought I did, because widows were the only women permitted to own their own property, and the only ones who could act without asking their father or their husband or brother for permission. So she's a widow with agency. And then my next problem, which I'm not sure I solved entirely, was that at the time, men and women would not have been in a room alone together unless they were married or related to each other. Well, you can't have a sleuth not be able to talk to half the population. So the best I could do was have her occasionally have a queasy feeling in her stomach when she goes into a room to talk to George Washington, because she knows it's not right, but you're not going to say no to the commander in chief. So that's the way I let her weave her way through the plot. In terms of constables and sheriffs, yes, there would have been constables and sheriffs, and there were at the time, but luckily I didn't need to address them in book 1. I'm grappling with them in book 2, and Eleanor, I may call you.
Okay, Carol.
Well, I really enjoyed doing the research in policing in the early 1930s, and I was surprised to find out that there was so much I could use for my cops. When I first decided that Stephen was going to be a cop in 1934, I thought back to the detectives that I really enjoy reading from the golden age of mystery, Poirot and Inspector Allen, and so those people, and they use so much of their mental ability. So I wanted Stephen to grab onto that kind of analysis, the deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning and so forth. And I found out that in the early 30s, police forces in the United States were beginning to use psychological profiling. It had been some time since Freud and Jung and so forth had put out their different theories of your personality and how your childhood could affect your adulthood and so forth. And although Stephen's boss really doesn't buy into any of that modern stuff that he calls it, Stephen is intrigued by that. And Olivia buoys him up with that. She says, oh yes, stick with your guns on that, because that's going to be a thing later. This is the future. So she supports him in that. I found that, yes, he can use fingerprints. Ballistics have been in use since the 1830s. He can rely on tests for poison. The Marsh test was done in 1836, and I used that in Threshold of Deceit because my victim was poisoned with arsenic. The Federal Crime Lab was set up in Washington in 1932. So Stephen is very excited that he sends reports to J. Edgar Hoover, I don't know, every week or every month about the kinds of crimes. And they're building a national, they didn't call it a database then, but files. He also can use the national, Federal Bureau's fingerprint files if he needs to. because they're gathering fingerprints of criminals from all around the country. So I have him be excited about the new stuff he has to use. When he comes into Olivia's time, he also, of course, is blown away by TV because, you know, he's used to radio and being able to see it, and then with the big screen and so forth. So he watches some of the CSI and so forth to see what cops are doing in the future. So that's kind of a little fun thing for him to get a glimpse. But like we've said before, researching it has been so much fun. And one final thing, I got so lucky. I had to find a new go-to cop for my third book. And the guy that I found is the historian for the Onondaga County Sheriffs. So he is a wealth of information. I needed to know about call boxes. He told me 100 times more information I could possibly use, but just a fantastic resource. So I'm very, very lucky for him, with him.
Okay, we're running a little short of time here, but my next question is, dialogue brings characters to life and differentiates one character from another. Dialogue also helps to establish the time period in which the characters live. What challenges did you face in writing dialogue? Who or what helps you make the dialogue accurate? And Mally, I'm going to begin with you because I know you ran up against a problem.
Oh, I did. Nobody wants to read a modern mystery with language from 1780. So I went light. I used slightly formal construction, minimized contractions, used period specific language in letters and proclamations, but didn't want to slow the story or the reader down to try to figure out what I meant. The fun I had was that I would occasionally use words for drunkenness or curses that were period specific, and you could tell what the character means just from the context. But other than teaching myself how to curse in 18th century English, I tried to leave it alone.
Well, you also had George Washington,
Oh,
a real
yeah.
character.
Well, that's true. That scared me to death. George and Alexander Hamilton are characters in the book, and putting words in their mouth was really scary. And an historian who was nice enough to read my book kind of did those snap out of it word slaps in response and said, "You just made George too grave. Why is he always grave? He sounds like he ate something he didn't like." So I loosened George up a little bit.
Okay, Eleanor.
Of course, I made the same decisions, some of the same decisions that Mally did. If you read the literature from that period, what they would have been reading, nobody ever used one word when 100 would do. So the books are 700 pages long, and there is no way that anyone now is going to want to read 700-page murder mystery. So I try to keep the construction formal, and I do use contractions, but I use them mainly for someone like Rouge, not for Lydia, you know. So there is a difference in a sense, class. The one book that I really had a problem with was the newest one, Death in the Great Dismal. Because yes, a lot of the slang and a lot of the metaphors people use, we still use today because they're from the Bible, they're from Shakespeare. But now I'm in a different culture, and everyone has a Southern accent. Okay. Well, I went down to New York, and there's a museum where they have recorded people speaking in what they would call the Southern dialect, Black English. You could barely understand them. And the contemporary sources that I read where they tried to transcribe the language, well, you don't know if it's racism, if you don't know if it was accurate, and it was almost unreadable. So I tried to go very light, as Mally said. I
Mm-hmm.
tried to use some of the things that I heard and some of the things that I read, but I tried to put it in more contemporary English. You have to make it accessible to a modern reader, even if it's a little inaccurate. But it was a struggle. I admit it. It was a struggle.
Okay, Edith?
So, I'm a little later period, the late 1880s. But I have Quakers, and they still spoke with the thee and thy forms, which they originally did in the 1600s to not distinguish between familiar thee and thy, your family, close people, and people you're supposed to respect with the you form, because everyone is equal in God's eyes. But then it persisted until the point that nobody else in English was using thee and thy for your familiars. We all use you for all forms, singular and plural, and respect. And but they were still using it. Whittier still used it in his writing and his speech. And so I wanted all the Quakers in my books to use thee and thy. And in the first book, in Delivering the Truth, I asked my editor, Terry Bischoff, I said, Terry, does this slow it down? Like, is this taking the reader out? And she said, it's fine, use it. So I felt confident to do that. And I don't think it's hard. Like, maybe the first couple pages, it slows people down. Otherwise, I read Whittier's writings. I read newspapers and diaries. And, there were a lot of immigrants coming into Amesbury at the time to work in the carriage factories and the mills. So there were Irish and Polish and French Canadians. And so some of that creeps in. The detective is an Irish descent. And when he gets like shook, he gets a little more Irish in his speech. And then we go back to the language research. Could they use this, and what word could they use and not use? And there were some surprises, like I wanted to put in the word gumshoe. Well, that didn't come in till, I don't know, 1905, 1913 for a detective. But the word employee, that was mid 1800s. I don't remember the exact date. So there's different words that I always checked. If it sounded too modern, I checked if I could use it in dialogue or in, like in Rose's thoughts, because I write in first person.
Okay, Carol.
Oh, wait, one more thing. And speaking of famous people, so Whittier's a character, and I did make him a little more sprightly. Speaking of Washington, like he was pretty frail, and he lived another 4 or 5 years after the books, but I made him a little more sprightly than he probably was in real life.
Okay, Carol.
Okay, well, I'm the most modern of the four of us. And in some respects, there aren't too many differences. The differences I found in the research I did, of course, slang that changes, every 10 years, if not sooner. And in police vocabulary, like my go-to cop that I used for the first 2 books, he mentioned at one point persons of interest, and then we both in conversation realized that that's a 1980s term, and so I went back to using the word suspects. There's a book that I use, the Dictionary of Slang, and the only trouble with that, I'm still actually looking, and if any of you know, I'd love to know, I'm still looking for a book that I can, almost like a French English dictionary, where I can put in a word and look up the 1930s slang version of it. But the dictionary that I use, I have to come up with the word myself, and that it will tell me the etymology of it and what it meant and what time and what was used and so forth. One of the funny surprises, I know a lot of people, younger people, I think, the slang expression sweet that seems to be popular with some people these days was also very popular in the 1930s. So I gave one of my characters, that's his favorite thing to say. Of course, Swell and Aces, those are the classics. I've read a lot of books that were written in the early 30s, especially mysteries, but Stephen is not a hard-boiled cop. He's not a Sam Spade. So he would not talk that harsh talk. And he's also in a small town in upstate New York. So he doesn't have that New York City edge either. So I relied on memories from my grandfather, who was born in 1900. Stephen is born in 1901. I sort of thought back to some of his expressions that I remembered he used. My dad also had a couple of expressions that he never changed at all for his entire 96 years of life. He used the same words every decade. So I gave Stephen a couple of those. But in the end, like everybody else said, you don't want to bog the story down with such incredible accuracy that the modern writer says, what did that mean? You sprinkle it in to give the taste, like spices in cooking, really. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we're ready for the questions from the viewers. I haven't seen any questions so far.
There's one.
So,
There's one
oh, what is it?
from Kathleen.
What time period will you choose? And actually, I'm working on a different time period.
Okay.
Bronze
Yeah,
Age
me too.
Crete. I'm working, the first one is out. It's a murder mystery set in 1450 BC. No newspapers. So your research is all archaeological stuff and writings by archaeologists. And, but it's been absolutely fascinating. And I've been to Crete and I plan to go back and do more research, but it has been wonderful. I'm writing about what is popularly called the Minoans.
And I've written a mystery set in 1920, 21 Pasadena, California. And I've written several short stories. One of them is in 1925 Boston. So I'm kind of interested in the 1920s. I don't know. I don't have a contract yet. But.
I would move up to the go ahead, Maley. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I would pick the 1920s too, especially after COVID, because I think we're heading into another time, hopefully soon, where everyone is just going to want to be out and in big groups and at parties, just like the 20s.
I would move up to about 1940, just, shortly before we enter World War II. And I'm thinking about Camp X, which is a training camp straight north of me, just over the Canadian border. I'm close to the Canadian border. I'm north of Syracuse. And just over into Ontario, there is the remains of Camp X, which trained American soldiers to be spies in Europe because they knew we were going to enter the war. So I would focus on that time and place.
We have a question to Eleanor. Did you have to deal with class issues regarding dialect among white characters?
Yes, because Lydia comes from an upper crust family in Boston. And I actually just turned this one in. I had so many requests about the backstory for Lydia. And her family looks down on Reese because he is clearly a farmer. He's a weaver. He is not a wealthy man, although he's what we would consider middle class. He does well enough. And they do speak differently. They did speak differently. I kind of didn't focus on that to a large degree, but that would have been a big issue, along with the fact that he doesn't dress properly, doesn't have a carriage. Yes, very class riven.
Well, here's a question for all of you. What have your editors most advised or complained about in your work? In other words, what mistakes would you warn beginning historical mystery writers about?
probably putting in too much detail, which slows the story down. I haven't had that complaint, but I think that would be the advice.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I would too, but I would also say advice for any beginning writer is don't go back and revise and revise and rewrite chapter 1 and chapter 2 again. Just keep going.
Mhm.
Get to the end first.
Put out the crappy first draft.
Yeah. That's a skeleton, really. And then you have to add everything.
Although I cannot believe you write a 300-page outline, Eleanor.
Well, it's not exactly an outline. It's more like a first draft,
Okay.
but because what it does is solidify in my mind where I'm going with the story, who is probably going to be the murderer, and it gives me like a framework to work with. It doesn't, there have been many times when the finished draft is totally different, including to the title. Because I've changed so many things, but that first draft really tells me where I want to go. It gives me some scenes to hang everything else on. It gives me an idea of the plot. So it's not exactly an outline, not like Jeffrey Archer, who outlines every single thing. It's kind of, I'm a total pantser, so I usually do not know where I'm going with it. That's the first draft is where it helps me do that. Tells me everything.
Do the rest of you plot too, or do some of you just begin and then see where it takes you?
I just call it the first draft. I don't plot. That is my first draft, and then I start fixing things. Yeah, I'd rather not plot.
I always plot and outline at least to the halfway point, because what I do mostly is create my characters. Once I've created my characters, they start acting on their own, kind of. And I know that sounds silly if you're not a writer.
Not at all. Not at all.
Not silly.
I used to think that sounded silly, but I mean, in every single book I've written so far, I mean, it's only 3, but by the time I got 2/3 of the way through and one of them at the very end, the person I was positive was going to be the killer wasn't.
Right.
And
that's happened to me.
Yeah.
I was going to ask that question to all of you. Did your characters surprise you? Did they start living lives of their own?
Well, that's the fun, I mean, like Eleanor, I want to know where I'm going. So I do a pretty detailed outline, but then I want the fun of it, like go along for the ride with the characters as they do what you've programmed them to do.
Lydia was not supposed to be a main character. And in the first book, I needed someone who could interact between the Shakers and Reese, who wanted to question them. And she kind of took over. And now she's really, as far as some people are concerned, I could get rid of Reese and just have Lydia. You never know.
For me, the magic of writing is when the characters do stuff that I had no idea they were going to do it. And I'm typing and I have to keep typing to find out why she fell off her chair. Unconscious.
Exactly.
What's she doing on the floor? I have no idea.
You'll use the metaphor, but I was a swimming counselor when I was a teenager. So I have a diving board approach to plotting. You take 3 steps and then you dive. So I know the beginning. I can kind of get through chapter 3 or 4, and then it's just a dive off a high board.
Typing.
See what happens.
Yeah.
Well, Kim,
That's fun.
Kim, how are we doing on time?
We are at the last minute, so
okay, I would like to thank all the members of our panel today. It's been fabulous. Thank you, Edith, Maxwell, Eleanor Kuhns, Carol Pouliot, and Mally Becker. And to buy their books, click on chat and access the bookstore.
This comes out April 13th. I don't have a physical copy yet, but it comes out next month.
Oh, a lot of you have books coming out.
Yeah.
And
Thank you, everybody.
I don't know how
you, Janet.
You write like 4 books a year.
I do.
which is
do.
amazing, amazing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Janet.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.